morning, everybody. So, got a video on poverty and the way it's changed in the pandemic, because chapter 11 is about poverty and homelessness. We've already done some homeless videos. Excuse me. So, some of the poverty facts, the rate, and this was the last census, so we will get into one next year. In 2010, it was about 15%. So like 1 in 7, if you look at 7 people outside, one of those folks could be in poverty. The high percentage of poor is children, female-headed households, and non-white families. Most who are poor are also employed full-time. So nowadays it takes about 2.5 jobs to feed a family. In the 70s and 80s, it was about 1 to 1.5 jobs to feed a family, so somebody could stay home. So social work, there's 2 prevailing social attitudes. One is blaming the individuals for the impoverishment. So that's the culture of poverty, holding society responsible for the conditions that are creating poverty. Social work's emphasis is on empowerment and oriented support to gain self-sufficiency. So we do all we can to empower folks with the poverty issues that are going on. So here's some of the numbers for 2012. So this is about 8 years old, but it has to come out after the census. Family size, if it's just one of you, and a lot of us in college, even in graduate school I was at, it's 11,170. It changed a bit for Alaska and Hawaii because it's more expensive to ship goods up that way. If there's 2 of you, it's 15,000. 3 of you, it's 19,000. 4, and that's the standard poverty rate they talk about a lot, is 23,000. 5 is 27, 6 is 30, and a family of 7 is 34,000. So it only goes to 8 on this, but as you can see, the model for each additional person you add 3,960. It's about $4,000 total. So we've seen some videos here on homelessness, and with the homeless facts, there are misconceptions and myths. A lot of them is that they are caused by mental illness or drug abuse, which can be true for some, but the majority of homelessness, this is not the case. The other misconception is that there's always shelter space available. Now, in the summer and fall times, there is more space available, but in the winter and the colder months, there's often no shelter space available. Every place is filled up. Another one is that homeless people are unemployed, and that's not the case either all the time. Not everybody is employed, so it's important to understand that some people do hold a job and some are working 2 jobs and still can't pay the rent. So something to keep in mind, something to be challenged with. So last one is that government programs are sufficient, and that is semi-true, but we found more and more that there are a larger need for folks to have other programs other than just the government, especially the federal government ones. So the population's at risk. There's folks that experience domestic violence. So a lot of your social work places offer shelter to people that have experienced domestic violence, both the kids and the children and the wives, or the mothers or single fathers. Also, if you experience mental illness or have a diagnosis of mental illness, you would be more at risk. As mentioned earlier, the substance abuse disorders, they're at high risk. And then lastly, the veterans are at risk. And you'll find that as you get out in the field and work with some of the at-need populations, this is the case. So with social work and homelessness, we as social workers try to ensure affordable housing and adequate housing. So we become advocates for this. We also advocate for housing subsidies. So in the pandemic times, a lot of the legislation that we talked about last class has pushed for the inability to evict somebody because 40 million people lost their jobs. We also aim to strengthen the continuum of housing and income assistance, and then also income support services. Also funding prevention programs such as education and job training. That's an important one. That's a big one, and something that we work on. So then promoting living wage policies. That's something that's coming up in this election tomorrow. So promoting a livable wage. We'll all get to vote on that tomorrow. Now, with human rights and justice, homelessness is linked to economic factors such as lack of affordable housing, poverty and low income, and then also substance use issues, other social issues like mental illness and domestic violence. The unemployment facts, we had the rate about a year ago down to 4% unemployment. Now, if you also go to a website called Shadow Stats, you may see different numbers because of the way they report these. And this has an impact on family relations, separation, divorce, and desertion. So expansion of low-wage part-time positions without medical or retirement benefits. A lot of that came during the ACA or the Affordable Care Act. So they only let you work 29 hours a week and then at a low wage. So you weren't able to afford, say, healthcare, and you had to work extra jobs to just afford the healthcare, and then you could pay for housing. Another one, some of the unemployment benefits. We, as social work, we advocate for unemployment compensation and also workers' compensation. So the employee assistance programs, personal and family counseling for stress, mental health issues, and chemical dependency. I used to work at one of those called the Claremont Recovery Center. There's also transition services for dealing with job loss. So we would get folks into job training situations. Some of the criminal justice facts in the criminal justice system, we have law enforcement, courts, and correction officers. Punishment versus rehabilitation philosophy, overrepresentation of minorities in a lot of these law enforcement facilities. Some other criminal justice facts, the challenges for special population groups like older prisoners, persons with mental illness, and persons with mental retardation or an IQ below 70. Also, sex offenders, and then incarceration of men and women with children. How do we get child protective services involved in that situation? Here's the breakdown of some of this. So in the criminal justice system and the process, we have usually started with the police investigation, arrest, and booking. If it's unsolved, there's no arrest or they're released without prosecution. Then there's the prosecutor and defense attorneys. So initial court appearance, preliminary hearing, and the charges are dropped or dismissed. And then there's bail or detention if something comes up. From there, you go to grand jury if there's no indictment. And then arraignment if the charges are dismissed. And then guilty plea at trial if they're acquitted or not, then they would have sentencing and the appeals. That's all a court situation here. And then in corrections, there's penitentiary, and if you get out, you go on parole. Probation, you can also have pardon and clemency, and then a fine, and then they would become out of the system. So you see how complicated that is and why the need for social work advocates is huge there. So social workers in the criminal justice system, we've started to have more and more, and in Cincinnati, I know there's an internship with Cincinnati Homicide Department. There's police social workers, and also forensic social workers to help with evidence, child protective service case, probation and parole officers, and then social workers in correctional facilities. The crime victim and advocates, that's a lot of what we do with different social work assistants here. There is also the juvenile diversion programs and the mediation for victims and offenders. So as a social worker, we want to advocate all the way through. Sometimes there's a victim and witness protection program. So this is kind of the vicious spiral you can get in with a lack of affordable housing and homelessness because of folks living outside. So this was the video I had picked out for you all about the info on how poverty has been affected by COVID-19, and also the credit card debt bubble that could burst because of coronavirus. So here is the
Why
intro.
is that important? Because developing countries borrow a tremendous amount of money, and how they borrow that money and how they're able to pay back that money is critical for their long-term sustainability and growth. The IMF is predicting, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, the world is going to face the greatest depression since the 1930s. And along with that comes a significant recession in low-income countries. The result of these economic challenges and pressures is an increase in debt vulnerability. African ministers recently said that they have about $44 billion in debt service obligations through the end of this year, and called on the international community to help them cover those payments so that they're able to respond both to the health and the economic challenges that their countries face. So this gets to the question of, why is debt important? Why does it matter? What's its impact on the world's lowest income countries? Well, here's what happens. As countries take on greater and greater levels of debt, more and more of their government spending has to go to service that debt, to pay back that debt. And sometimes they're faced with trade-offs where countries are spending more money on paying back the debt that they've borrowed than they are on healthcare or education. And if countries default on that debt, if they're unable to pay it back, it can have really serious economic ramifications and impact their ability to borrow. And the challenge is that in the world's lowest income countries, they don't have the same sort of fiscal or monetary capabilities as the world's richest countries. So they're dependent on a global response. They're dependent on global support to help them find capital to address the immediate crisis, but also to address the longer-term economic impacts. So what can be done about it? The IMF has announced that it's providing debt relief through its Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust for 25 of its poorest borrowing countries. But there are advocates in the development community who are calling on the IMF to go farther, not just to rely on donor capital, but to rely on their own reserves to provide some of this debt forgiveness. The G20 also agreed to what is essentially a debt freeze through the end of the year for the world's poorest countries. While those countries will later have to pay off that debt, it will immediately free up some funds so that they can respond to the immediate healthcare and economic crisis. But again, development advocates have said that it's essentially just kicking the can down the road on important issues of debt sustainability, that it has to essentially be a stepping stone on the path to a more robust conversation about debt and debt sustainability. And that the systems in place today to address these issues are insufficient. Traditionally, debt forgiveness decisions has been made by the Paris Club, an informal group of 22 creditors who get together to discuss debt forgiveness or debt restructuring programs. The challenge is that a growing amount of lending comes from countries that aren't part of that Paris Club. China, for example, is not part of the Paris Club, and this presents a growing challenge because 20 to 25% of debt in sub-Saharan Africa is owned by China. And one critical thing to know about debt is that if one creditor or one group of creditors provides debt relief, but not everyone participates, you end up with a situation where the debt relief from one creditor may in fact just go to pay off the debt obligations to another. So having a coordinated system of debt relief and forgiveness and discussion and decision-making is critical. So development advocates have long called for reforms in the process of how debt decisions get made, for inclusion of new creditors, and that includes also private creditors. Low-income countries often take on significant private debt in addition to public debt or borrowing that they're doing from multilateral development banks. And it's important that each of those components is considered as debt relief moves forward. When the G20 released their communique announcing their debt freeze, they left an opening for continued discussions around the issue. And we certainly expect this to be a part of the conversation in response to the current crisis and in general to having more sustainable development finance in the year and years ahead. So for all that coverage, stay tuned to DevX.
So as you can see, a lot of the debt is owned by China and sub-Saharan Africa. And during COVID, a lot of people are putting stuff on credit cards. So that's what this last video to finish off.
Over the last few months, Americans from all walks of life helplessly watched our economy come to a screeching halt. Businesses were forced to shut their doors, millions filed for unemployment, and the stock market crashed.
So as this pandemic worsens, millions and millions of Americans are skipping their credit card payments, and that is actually forcing many banks and lenders to prepare for perhaps worse economic fallout. So to talk more about this and more about what you can do is Jill Schlesinger. She is our CBS News business analyst. Thank you so much for joining us, Jill. It took like a really quick Google for me to find a ton of stories of people who are trying to figure out ways, not to pay their monthly payment on their credit cards because they had, people had problems with credit cards before. They were struggling under the weight of their credit card debt before. I can only imagine that this pandemic has made it worse.
Yeah, it's really crazy actually, because the credit card bills that were accumulating started to pile up. And before the pandemic, we were actually at a 7-year high of credit card delinquencies. So obviously, with 26 million Americans claiming for new unemployment benefits, we know that this is going to be even worse when the next round of data start to pour in. Now, here's the issue. The credit card companies have been instructed by the government to give what's called forbearance, which means breathing room, no fees and penalties, give some people a little bit of leeway in paying things off, certainly no extra stuff piled on. And that is actually causing some problems for the credit card companies themselves. Not that anyone really feels bad for them, but, listen, they employ a lot of people also. Stock prices of some of the big issuers are taking a much bigger hit than other financial service firms because they know that many of these credit card accounts will not be able to get paid in full for a very long time.
So I guess, Jill, how are the banks and lenders being affected sort of long term?
Well, I think that if you are a big bank and your main business is credit card, then you're going to take a hit. When you look at a big banking center like a JP Morgan Chase, they're not just issuing credit cards. They're doing a lot of other activities. And, when you think about it, the firms that are out there and they've benefited for essentially 11 years of an economic recovery. So this is part of their game plan, that they know they've got to plan to write off loans when the economy turns. The question really is how long this lasts, and that we don't know yet, because the sooner that more of these people get off these unemployment benefits, get back to work, the better they'll be. But I don't see that happening as quickly as many others do.
But it seems like some of the lenders and some of the banks that run these credit cards are giving people a bit of a break here and there.
Right. I mean, forbearance is wonderful, right? You say, okay, don't pay this bill for 3 months, right? You maybe say a 90-day reprieve. But there are also reports that many of these companies are being quite squirrely when consumers actually call them up or get in touch with them. They say, okay, they're waiving their late fees, they're waiving their interest charges, but then they are creating a balloon payment that's due at the other end of this. And what they're also doing is, and I think that wisely, of course, if you're running a business, is they're shutting down lending facilities, meaning you might have thought your credit limit was $12,000, and the issuer might say, well, you know what, it's actually $5,000. And they can do that. It's perfectly legal. But before you start running up your credit card bill, be sure to understand what is your limit and what are the rules surrounding this forbearance period.
Jill, a lot of Americans are saving their stimulus checks because of life essentials instead of paying down debt. Practically speaking, is there a priority between paying off debt and saving for essentials? What's the good balance that people should be thinking about for those who are skirting on the edge?
I think if you're on the edge, if you're unemployed, if you've been negatively impacted financially from this pandemic, it's all about conserving your cash. So I would not be in a rush to pay down any debt at all. And I've been fielding questions from my podcast every single day, and I have found that people really want to try to get rid of that debt. And I'm saying, look, in normal times, I love you to pay down high interest debt. These are not normal times. We're at the extreme. You've got to conserve your cash for a rainy day. It's not a rainy day, my friends. It is pouring. It is a storm. It's a 1-in-100-year flood. It's a hurricane, and it's a wildfire, and it happened all at once. So the time to actually pay down your debt will be when we understand what your financial condition is, probably in the next 60 to 90 days. For now, do not be in a rush to pay down any debt. Conserve your cash. Do prioritize your bills. There's a great tool on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's website, consumerfinance.gov, or if you just Google Bill Priority Tool, CFPB, you'll see. And the only thing that I think is your priority right now is feeding you and your family. Everything else is negotiable.
So then this isn't a time to sort of worry about pulling yourself out of credit card debt, or, maybe you have a regular paycheck and maybe this is a good time to do that.
Okay, so let's draw a distinction. You have a job, it seems secure, you've got the cash flow. Now, if you can, and you can start accelerating that debt payment, fantastic. Same with your student loans. There is no interest being charged on federal student loans until September 30th. If you've got extra cash flow and you can pay down a 6% student loan, this is a great time to do that. If you have extra cash flow and you've got a 16% credit card bill, sure, it's a great time to do that. But if you don't have 6 to 12 months of your living expenses sitting in a safe place, please make that the number one priority.
Jill Schlesinger, always bringing the knowledge when we so sorely need it. Jill, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Warning. If you have more than
All right, so she said to have 6 to 12 months of expenses. That does seem like a lot to me. If you guys do anything with financial wellness, there are a few folks that advocate 3 to 6 months, and even that's hard. They say the average American has about $400 or doesn't have $400 for an emergency. So maybe $399, but it just gives an example of where poverty and debt has gone. Student debt has now surpassed credit card. The $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion of credit cards, which can be eradicated in bankruptcy, has now been surpassed by student loans, which cannot be eradicated in bankruptcy. So, if anything of the message, finding ways to live more simply, finding ways to cut any expense of things that's not needed, which I know is hard, but even with the pandemic, we went ahead and, cut some of the monthly fees that weren't for survivables just in case, like the Netflix and even Amazon Prime, things of that nature. We've since gotten back into those. I think for a few months they offered us free internet as educators, so looking out for deals like that. Not to get taken out by shrinkflation, which we've mentioned, inflation even. If you do take out student loans, only take what you need, and the interest-free ones are often the best. A few other things, because counseling people that will be in these predicaments will be of huge importance. And in the summer, if you're able to, even grow a garden. There's some folks that's the most important thing that they could do, because growing a garden is cutting your food bill in half, finding ways to get exercise and eat the proper amount of vitamins and minerals. So lots of things here on poverty and homelessness and how we advocate as the social worker. So as we were finishing up chapters 10 and 11 this week, we're getting to the point now where you guys can turn in your presentations online. If you film them, say off of your cell phone, you could do a YouTube live link if you would like, if you don't have storage on your phone, and film the PowerPoint that describes your situation of when you went to do the field observation project. We are going to be doing chapters 12, 13, and 14 in the next few weeks. And I'm trying to find, next week will be social work and health, rehabilitation, and mental health. We'll be getting into that. Some of you have asked about if you can present online, which is fine. So yes, be sure to have everything in before Thanksgiving. Then I'll post your final. And that will be a self-assessment project. So for those of you that are behind, I am keeping everything open so you can still turn it in. There's a small late penalty, but just be sure to get everything done. There's lots of forgiveness opportunities, so just get the work done. Those papers especially, then your PowerPoint presentation. And with the discussion board, just make sure to post up your thoughts about some of these different videos on homelessness and poverty and horticulture therapy and urban farming, and then reply to classmates to get your full credit. But I will keep those open so you guys can have the opportunity to pass the class and get everything complete. There's definitely a lot of interesting videos, and the knowledge of what you'll need to be a complete social worker, psychologist, educator, teacher. These are things you'll use in every field. If you are a social work major, keep in mind that we're setting you guys up to take the LSW exam. So you can get a license in social work, which does mean social work jobs, opportunities everywhere. You will be doing field your senior year also, which is where you actually get out and work in the field for a whole semester. Some people go to the juvenile detention center or a family domestic violence shelter or even a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter. So we're setting you up to have the background information for policy and practice in social work and all the work that you'll need for being a good social worker with a license and having field complete, which then qualifies you for advanced standing. And all of the credits you take in social work now and undergrad at Central State University is accredited by CSWE, which is the Council on Social Work Education. So it gets you halfway done with graduate school. So you qualify for the advanced standing where you would be done in less than a year with your master's degree. One more set of internships where you do the last 450 or 550 hours at another placement to become a clinical and independent licensed social worker. So you can do this and open up your place of business. So that is all we have for now. If you have questions, again, feel free to email and stop in during office hours. So see you guys soon.